Some people believe that when you become an administrator that you stop teaching, and you actually don't. It's just that your audience changes somewhat. You're really teaching, inspiring staff.
You've just been listening to Ralph Nigro, retired principal and former president of the Ontario Principals Council in Ontario, Canada. Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. Ralph tells a story of how, as a new vice principal, he faced immense challenges in his early days of school administration. From being booed off the stage to inspiring future leaders, he shares some really heartfelt lessons on resilience, kindness, and why teaching doesn't stop when you become a school leader.
This week's podcast is brought to you by the word perseverance, from the Latin, which means to persist steadfastly. It emphasizes what's needed to push through challenges in order to achieve character and hope. As a school principal, it aligns with themes like grit and growth mindset, making perseverance a powerful concept for navigating school leadership problems, concerns, and conflicts. There's hope beyond the challenge.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for ways to use restorative practices to navigate those challenges you face daily as a school principal. Steve's away this week, so let's join your host, Shelley, and me, Stan. You mentioned that 10 times in your first 3 months as a vice principal you wanted to quit. What kept you going? What made you keep going?
I remember one very vivid example where I was decided I'm going to quit. I'm going to come back Monday and I'm going to say, put me back in the classroom. I don't want to do this. And it was the second to last week, I remember, before the Christmas break. And I was in a high school that had with a principal and a colleague vice principal. And it was just a series of negative events that happened that week, and complicated by the fact that one of my colleagues had lost a parent and had to travel back home to be with their family. And another one, the spouse was hospitalized and they had to take some time off. Here I was, about 2.5 months in the role, 3 months in the role, and by myself with
Not sure if you want to do it. Yeah.
no assistance in the school.
Yeah.
And that week, I remember there was a situation where a couple of former students decided to drive a vehicle into the staff parking lot, and were driving erratically, and they crashed into about 5 staff cars. They totaled about 3 of them and severely damaged another 2 or 3. And so dealing with that with the police, and then some staff members whose cars had been damaged or totaled coming down and yelling at me that we've been telling you and the principal that things are getting out of control here. And I get it. They were upset because their cars were damaged, but it's not the type of thing that we had any intel about. I don't believe to this day that we could have somehow prevented that from happening. But I did go through the process and did identify some other students in the school who were involved with it, and they were suspended. And at the end of that week, I remember it was on a Friday, and we had an assembly. And I gather that one of the students who was suspended for their involvement in that situation in the parking lot was quite popular. And I remember the assembly was ending, and I just went up, wanted to say, have a great weekend. See you Monday, one more week till break. Because of the student's popularity, because his story had gotten out to friends, there was a really horrible reaction from the student body, to the point where I was literally booed off the stage by the entire school, because it just caught on. And of course, it was one of those things. But I was a vice principal back in the day when vice principals didn't win popularity contests. I remember going back into my office, and this was 3 months away from leaving a high school that I had been at for a number of years and was quite popular. And I remember thinking, I used to go up on stage and everybody would cheer, and now they almost booed me off the stage and wanted me to leave for good. And I said, I can't do this. It was about 5 o'clock, and I was wrapping things up. And I remember 2 veteran teachers, one from the English department and one from the science department, came down, and they said, we want to talk to you. They saw what happened, and they said to me, don't let that determine what you do next. You're doing a great job here. We all see it. And I think that that really helped. I didn't come in on
Sure.
one day and quit, but those are the types of things when I talk about recognizing, acknowledging when people do good work, it's because I know personally how important that was to me during some very difficult times. And nobody wants to go home at night thinking that they did a bad job. People want to go home at night thinking that they made a difference in the lives of children when they work in education.
And those few words from those teachers made such an impact, right? And
Yeah.
it wasn't a production, it wasn't a letter, it wasn't a phone call to your supervisor, just a direct person to person and very heartfelt. And the impact that had on you is quite profound there as well. Hmm.
You mentioned the phrase making a difference. And I wonder if there are some success stories or stories where you did make a difference for staff or students, stories that might compel someone to consider becoming a principal or vice principal. Because we've been talking about the downside, like the conflict side,
Yeah.
the tough side. What are some success stories or situations where you made a difference?
Yeah. There are a lot of scenarios. For me, the biggest success stories are as a teacher and then later as an administrator. Some of the students with whom I've worked closest deciding to pursue teaching and ultimately administration. And when I and then reaching out to me and say that somehow I influenced them. About 5 years ago, one of my former students, when I was a history teacher in downtown Toronto, became principal in Toronto. And I called him and I said, you make me feel very proud yet very old. Uh, And I think those are for me the greatest success stories. I've taught young people who have gone on to do exceptional things in medicine and in law and journalism. But and that's great. And hearing from them this past June when word got out that I was retiring, hearing from a whole bunch of them and sharing some stories about that this type of thing that I always thought about, but it was great to hear that somehow they feel that my involvement in their lives as students helped them to become successful. And I think I don't consider myself special. I think anyone who's a dedicated educator, whether you're a classroom teacher or an administrator or CYW or an educational assistant or a school clerical who loves working with children, anyone can make a difference in the lives of young people and shouldn't stop trying to do so and should never think that they can't.
Why should somebody go into administration as a principal or vice principal?
Look, eh, it's challenging, but it also is very rewarding. Some people believe that when you become an administrator that you stop teaching and you actually don't. It's just that your audience changes somewhat. You're really teaching, inspiring staff. You're working with larger groups of parents to help them understand the education system. And sometimes if you go into a traditionally underserved community, they really rely on the principal to help them to understand, to help them navigate the bureaucracy, which is often quite problematic in education, just like in other sectors. So it's a different type of work. I've often wondered, and people have asked me up until the day that I left my last school, and they said, "Do you miss teaching?" And I say every day. Um, do I regret moving forward? No. So for me, it was very positive. The majority of teachers who move on to administration, I think, are quite content with their decision and believe that it was the right decision, not just for themselves, but also for children and for the system.
Are there any other stories that you would like to share with us? Like when you get together with colleagues, those affinity groups, there's always war stories that come up, right?
You should be careful about asking me to share stories. I'm a former history teacher. So there's so many, but I think one of the classic stories, only because there was such a big audience out there, and I always found it fascinating that school events like the prom, or even I go back far enough in admin in Toronto when we still had school dances. Um, and that's, I don't think anybody has school dances anymore, but I remember we had one event that was an athletic banquet. I always found it fascinating with school dances and with these other events how teenagers think that they invented drinking at these events. And
And sneaking it in.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it was one of those things. I met with the VPs ahead of time. I said, okay, we're going to show up. Can one of you show up an hour before with me? Because we got to go through the bathrooms and check above the ceiling tiles and all of that. And sure enough, we went, stood up in the stalls and above the ceiling tiles. I must have pulled down about 6 or 7 40 ounces of vodka and tequila and a bunch of other things, peach schnapps. And and I set them aside and I said, "There's gonna be some very disappointed young people." I said, "I can bring these back to the liquor store and maybe trade them in for some wine and give them away as prizes at the staff luncheon or something." And and I remember one of the VPs said, "Are you gonna say something to the students who are out there who were just coming in and sitting at their tables?" And I said, "Let's wait till the festivities start, and then I'll come back." I left them with the manager in her office at the venue. And when there was a break after the first set of awards, I walked over and I grabbed them and I grabbed 2 of the 40 ounces of vodka, and I purposely walked right down the middle between all of the tables holding these 40 ounces of vodka. And I walked up to the podium and I put them on the top and I said, "Unfortunately, the Smirnoff Award will not be awarded tonight."
Right.
My first principal, when I became a VP, he taught me early on, and I've always thanked him for it, that at the end of the day, if you can't laugh about something, it's not good.
Mm.
You need to be able to sit down and have a good laugh with your admin team colleagues, because that, if nothing else, is a coping mechanism.
And you
I
need to
can
have
remember.
those people to do that with, right? And
Absolutely.
know that tomorrow you're back to business, but right now we're gonna have a laugh about it. Yeah.
I remember going into an elementary school where the principal asked me to come in because she had confiscated a knife from a student who was in a behavior class. And she said what had happened was somebody brought it to they found it in the schoolyard and brought it to a supervising teacher who brought it into the office. And after everybody was let inside, a student came to the principal and said, "Has anybody found a knife that I brought to school today?" And, and the principal said, "You mean this one right here?" And he goes, "Yeah, that's my knife." She said, "I think we're going to have a
Love
talk."
that.
And you can guess that there were lots of special needs for that individual, and that he was in a behavior class and he needed some additional support. So it just started a whole conversation and a violence threat risk assessment
Mhm.
process. But like you think about it, you're coming in and confessing to bringing the weapon. So it was that kind of thing that afterwards we laughed about it, like you said.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the safety issues are something that I always were always a priority for me. And in fact, when I retired at the end of June and there was a small event for me, I shared that perhaps throughout my career, one of the nicest things that any parent ever said to me was after I left my last high school and I was back. I think I left to go to the principals association, and then I came back in late October for graduation, which used to be a fall graduation at the time. And I ran into to 2 parents, husband and wife, and I'd never met them before. And and they stopped me and they said, um, "We wanted to meet you, and we wanted to say thank you." I said, "Oh," uh, and then they went on and they said, "Our daughters," and there's 3 daughters that went through the school, and they said, "When you first arrived at the school, our oldest was in grade 11 and the youngest was in grade 9, and they've both graduated, and then the year after, sorry, the middle daughter was in grade 9, then the younger one came the year after, and she's now graduating tonight, and that's why we're here." And then they said, the father said to me, "The whole time that our daughters were here, we always knew that you would keep them safe."
Mm.
And I said, and that was that was really reaffirming to me because it made me realize that all of the efforts that I put into safety, because I was always the guy who, if a call comes through on the walkie talkie and it's something that could be about a student being hurt, drop everything and run. And that was always my approach. And it was, I was happy to see that it was noticed and that somebody mentioned it and had the kindness to reference it after I had left the school.
Awesome to hear that and
Yes.
to get that kind of thank you, because
Mm.
I don't think that's the case with most principals or vice principals, that they actually are thanked for what they do.
I've always said you don't get a lot of accolades in the role, and the ones that you do get, you always accept them with grace and humility.
Yes. Accept the gift. Yep.
Yeah, I had a student who probably 7 years after, or maybe 8 years, I was an elementary principal for a while, who called me out of the blue. He's someone who I saw fairly regularly in my office, and he invited me to his father's funeral, uh, certainly to the wake anyway. And I was just, wow, I didn't realize the impact that I had,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
just very grateful and humbled by it.
yeah, and the opposite is true, and that you remind people that you do have an impact, and you can have a negative impact, and that's why you always have to be on your best behavior and always act professionally and morally, I would say, when it comes to working with young people.
Any last stories from the historian, aka principal?
I will say I referenced retiring recently, and at the function, my retirement, I was fortunate enough that the MC at my retirement was, I refer to him as my little cousin. He's actually my cousin. He's 10 years younger, but also a principal now in the system. And he told some great stories about what it was like growing up with my brother and I. I was 10 years older. I'm 10 years older. My brother's 8 years older, and how he thought that he had 2 big brothers. And in referencing what he said later with colleagues since then, I said, to me, that is testament to my philosophy, which is that you should always be kind to children when they're very young, because at some point they learn to speak. And if you're
Mhm.
not, it could be problematic.
This has been terrific. Thank you very much for taking the time
Yeah.
to share some of these stories. Really appreciate that. As you heard in the stories here, we can't underestimate the impact of kindness. It has a profound impact, and the effects of recognition in small acts of kindness from colleagues, staff, and students last a long time. That recognition is good for principals to receive and, in turn, to give to others. Starting as a teacher and moving into a school leadership role, it's helpful to realize that you're still teaching. You're inspiring and teaching other adults as a school leader. Find out more about our work with restorative circles that really do exactly that: help teach and inspire adults in your school building through restorative practices. Check it out, www.restorative.ca. I want to say hug your principal today, but if that's a no-go, then say a hug of appreciation. A kind word goes a long way.